interview on The Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. As the Iran-Israel war enters its 7th day, we asked, how has Iran fared? How long can it withstand the battering that it seems to be receiving from Israel? And is Ayatollah Khamenei safe? Prime Minister Netanyahu has claimed that Israel has complete control over the skies of Tehran, and on the ground, residents of the Iranian capital are fleeing the city in panic and fear. Meanwhile, Iran's foreign minister is meeting 3 of his key European counterparts tomorrow to see if a ceasefire is possible. But President Trump insists on an unconditional surrender. So where do things stand on day 7 of the war? That's the key issue I shall raise with the co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Trita Parsi. Dr. Parsi joins us live from Washington, D.C. Dr. Parsi, let me start with a simple general question. How do you view the Iran-Israel conflict?
This is a completely unnecessary war, an illegal war of aggression. There was absolutely no evidence that Iran was in anywhere near, imminently near building a nuclear weapon. In fact, all of the intelligence services of the world, except the Israeli one, continues to insist that there was no active weapons program in Iran. The IAEA has confirmed that once again just in the last couple of days. What the IAEA had said in their report was that Iran was in breach of some of its reporting requirements. That's very different from saying that there's an active nuclear weapons program. In fact, the IAEA said that there was no evidence of such kind for them to draw such a conclusion. So this is, again, very similar to what you saw in 2003. And a war of aggression based on false claims about nuclear weapons.
In which case, why do you believe Israel started this conflict on the 13th of June? Clearly, you don't believe the claim from Jerusalem that just days or weeks were left before Iran would develop a nuclear weapon. Do you therefore think that behind the disguise of nuclear weaponry, this is an attempt at regime change? That's something Prime Minister Netanyahu has begun to hint at several times.
I think this was both an effort for regime collapse more so than regime change, and I'll explain the difference. But more than anything else, to set the stage for a US-Iran war. From the Israeli perspective, this has actually never been about nuclear weapons. This has been about the balance of power in the region, the growth of Iranian power, and a desire from the Israeli side to bring the US into war with Iran in order to dramatically reduce Iran's strength and restore a balance that is much more favorable towards Israel. This is something that Israel cannot do on its own, even though, of course, Israel has been affected in some of its attacks so far. But the United States is much, much more effective in doing. If fear of a nuclear weapon actually was driving Israel's calculations, it would have accepted the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that the Obama administration negotiated, precisely because it did block all of Iran's pathways towards a nuclear weapon. In fact, the Israeli Atomic Energy Program endorsed the JCPOA because they were looking at it strictly from a non-proliferation perspective, and as a result saw it as being very satisfactory. The second point in regards to regime change and regime collapse. Regime change is when you actually try to install another government. You take responsibility for what happens after the war. That's what happened in Iraq. And it meant that the success or failure of the subsequent Iraqi government would be part of the scorecard for the United States. A regime collapse strategy, which appears to be what they're trying to do here, is one in which you just take out the existing regime. You don't make any effort to actually install a new government. You don't take responsibility for what happens. Instead, you welcome the chaos that will follow once there is a collapse of the existing regime, and you let that chaos fester.
I hear the interesting and important distinction you're making between regime change and regime collapse. But isn't it true that this is a regime in Tehran that is committed to the destruction of the government and the state of Israel? So surely from an Israeli point of view, the collapse of the regime, regardless of what succeeds it, makes a lot of sense, because you're then doing away with a regime that is publicly committed to the annihilation of Israel.
The one regime in the region right now that actually is committed to the destruction of another state is what Israel is doing in Gaza. Theoretical arguments about what Iran may want to do and may not want to do is not sufficient for this to be lawful. At the end of the day, if the Israelis view this in such a manner, there is an argument for them to do this. They will be in breach of international law. However, that is not what they're doing. What they're doing is that immediately after starting the war, within 24 to 48 hours, they rush to Washington, and they're putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the United States for the United States to enter that war. Israel should fight its own wars, particularly the wars that it foolishly started itself. The United States has its own interests that it needs to focus on. And its interests are such that the Middle East is no longer a vital area for the United States. China, for instance, is much, much more important. All of these different things are distracting the United States from its core interests, while dragging the United States into more regime change, regime collapse, needless wars in the Middle East. Israel has a responsibility to be able to take consequences for its own action, rather than constantly going to Washington and demanding that the United States comes in and cleans up the messes that it creates.
Let's focus for a moment on the way the war has gone over the last 7 days. Netanyahu has said that this war could go on for weeks. On the other hand, in a piece that you've written for Responsible Statecraft, you say Israel needs a swift and decisive victory. A prolonged war of attrition may ultimately favor Iran. On what basis do you say that? Do you really believe Iran can win?
I'm not saying that Iran can win, nor do I think necessarily that Israel is going to win. I think this is a lose-lose proposition, and this is precisely why they're begging the US to come into the war. But a prolonged war means that over time, Israel's anti-air interceptors run out faster than Iran's arsenal of long-distance missiles. The Iranians have more long-distance missiles than the Israelis have interceptors, and they produce missiles faster than the United States produces interceptors. So if this goes on for a very long time, absent, of course, that Iran's capability to shoot those missiles through the launchers, etc., are completely destroyed, it's that one factor, I think, does not bode well for Israel. Then there is, of course, the question of Israel's ability to sustain this in its population. Israel's already been in somewhat of a war for the last year and a half. Although, of course, that is a war in which has taken place largely in Gaza, and the Israeli public, to a large extent, but not fully, have been shielded away from the cost of it. All of these things come together. On the other hand, Iran is also a society in which the population no longer tolerates or will be forgiving of a long-term war. It's different than from what you see in Yemen, for instance, in which the Houthi government can sustain such a war because the state of the country is already in a place in which expectations, so to say, are not necessarily particularly different. That is not the case in Iran. The Iranian public is in complete shock. They did not expect that 2 days before scheduled negotiations, the Israelis would start a war.
I hear what you say, that Israel is likely to run out of interceptors before Iran runs out of missiles. But look at the situation as we speak. Israel has already claimed that it has control of Tehran's skies. And we saw just 2 days ago that it's able to bomb Iran's public broadcaster whenever it wants. At the moment, clearly, Israel seems to have the upper hand.
Without a doubt, the Israelis have an upper hand in the sense that they do control the skies. They even have been able to prevent some of the missiles from being shot because they are identifying where the launchers are and taking those out. There's no doubt about that. But you have to keep in mind, just take a look at how the Iraq war started. In the beginning, things can look very well, but that doesn't mean that in the long run, those factors necessarily remain in place. And as a result, I do think that it is in the interest of the Israelis to finish this quickly. Again, if all of those things that you are saying is so true, why did Israel, within 24 hours, go back to the United States and beg the US to enter the war? That's a question you have to answer because it questions the very premises of your questions.
I'll come to that question in a moment's time. But there's a second factor that I want to draw your attention to. It seems that the 10 million population of Tehran, the capital, is in a state of fear and panic. The BBC repeatedly shows us images of roads jammed with traffic as people flee the city, scared that they could be the next victims of Israeli bombing. That is another sign, surely, that Israel has the upper hand, is succeeding.
It's a sign that obviously that the Israelis are indiscriminately bombing Tehran and creating panic. That's not necessarily a sign of upper hand. What you mentioned earlier on, their ability to control the skies, is a much more indication of how the technological superiority of the Israelis currently is giving them a very significant benefit. On the other hand, you have to also take into account that the Iranian missiles continue to rain down on Israel, and that the Israeli air defense system, combined with the American air defense system, so far have been insufficient to be able to prevent all of those from targeting key elements inside of Israel. How will that play out over the long run? We don't know that yet. And this is, again, part of the reason that despite the fact that the Israelis are in a stronger position, despite the fact that they are technologically superior, despite the fact that their military overall is much stronger, they do need a short victory here, a quick victory here, because it is unclear exactly how this will develop over the long run. I think part of the reason why you see that the Iranians have shot fewer missiles is because of the fact that they're preparing themselves for a longer war, calculating, perhaps incorrectly, but nevertheless calculating that that will give them a benefit.
Let's bring in America at this point. CBS, the news channel in America, has reported just 24 hours ago that Trump has approved plans to enter the war, but hasn't decided whether America will or won't. Do you believe America is about to enter the war, that we could see that happening in the next 24 or 36 hours? Or is Trump simply putting pressure on Iran to secure a deal? Because he keeps talking about the possibility of negotiations and a deal.
If you listen closely to what Trump is saying, he is doing all of those things. He is preparing to go into the war. And he's also putting pressure on the Iranians. And he has not made up his mind exactly how he will use this pressure. Will he use it in order to launch a war, or will he use it to try to get a deal? I think that there's a strong desire on his end, and there certainly is a strong desire in the White House as a whole, meaning that amongst many of his advisors, to not enter this war and get a deal. The problem that he set up for himself is that halfway through the negotiations that actually were going quite well, he changed the goalpost and he adopted the Israeli negotiating position, which was, instead of seeking to restrict Iran's nuclear program, he adopted the Israeli position of zero enrichment and dismantlement of the nuclear program. As soon as that happened, predictably, the negotiations started to stall. Trump is not known for his patience, and his impatience led to a scenario in which the Israelis, again, predictably, took advantage of the situation and convinced him that if he gives them a green light for them, only them, to take military action, they could force the Iranians to essentially surrender. But again, within 48 hours, 24 to 48 hours, they went back to Israel, to the United States, and asked for US's involvement. If he wants a deal, which I do think deep inside he does, I do not believe that he will get one unless he discards the Israeli red line and goes back to the American red line of no weaponization. If that is the red line, there is a path to a deal. But as long as he insists on dismantlement of the program, I fear that we will see war more likely than we will see a deal.
We're coming into hypothetical territory, but if Trump were to enter the war, presumably he would use the B-2 stealth bombers and the bunker busters to attack Fedro. And presumably if he did that, and he did it with sufficient expertise, he could destroy that critical site. At that point, wouldn't Iran sue for peace?
If Fordo is struck. First of all, we do not know what is left in Fordo because it appears that the Iranians may have already moved a lot of things out of it, which means that it may essentially be an empty gate. Secondly, the core leverage that the Iranians have is not just Fordo, it's the fact that they have a stockpile of 60% enriched uranium. Where is that stockpile? Is it in Fordo? Is it elsewhere? We have not seen radiation come out of the places that the Israelis have bombed so far. So it doesn't indicate that necessarily the stockpile has been targeted. So even if Fordo is lost, but they have the stockpile, it means that they still have a pathway to a nuclear weapon, which means that the objective of preventing a nuclear weapon through military means has, at least at that point, still not been successful. Moreover, mindful of the fact that the Iranians have the capability of restructuring all of that program because they have the know-how, even if you destroy this stockpile, even if you destroy Fordo, it does not mean that the pathway to a nuclear weapon has been destroyed. However, through a negotiated deal, similar to the JCPOA, or even much stronger, I think Trump has the ability to get a stronger deal because he's willing to put more carrots on the table. That's where you actually get a real prevention of a weaponization program. And if that, again, is really the objective, we should not be in this war right now. If regime change, if restoring some sort of an artificial balance of power in the region in which Israel has dominance is the objective, then yes, going into these wars at least have a degree of logic to it.
Not recently, but in the earlier days of the war, the message that came from Iran was that if America were to join the war, Iran wouldn't hesitate to attack and bomb American bases in the Middle East. According to Al Jazeera, there are 19 US bases in the Middle East which house some 40 to 50,000 soldiers. Would Iran actually carry out that threat? Because that could lead to a regional war and to some much worse treatment by the Americans in response.
Well, if the Americans are attacking in the first place, the question is if the Iranians will calculate that responding to that will make it worse, or if not responding to that will make it worse. We have seen so far that when the United States believes that it can get away with bombing a country, it bombs it more. Let's see what happened in Yemen. The Houthis fought back, almost took down several American airplanes, and after 45 days, and this is the Houthis, this is Yemen, this is not Iran. After 45 days, Trump called it quits. He declared victory even though he had achieved nothing. I think that the Iranian calculation will be that if Trump goes in that direction, they will target the US bases in the region. And as you said, there's 40 to 50,000 troops there. Their air defenses are weaker than that of Israel. Iran would not be using long distance missiles for those. It would use shorter and medium range missiles, of which it has an even larger arsenal. So what it has depleted vis-a-vis Israel does not affect its ability to target those 19 bases around the region. This is part of the reason why a very strong coalition of America First conservatives are putting daily pressure on Trump not to do this, because this is not America's war. America should not even have given a green light to Israel to start this war in the first place, mindful of the fact that Israel's plan all along was to drag the US into it. This will kill a lot of Americans. This will destabilize the region. And we saw what this did in the past in the region. There would never have been an ISIS had there not been an invasion of Iraq. There would never have been that destabilization had there not been regime change efforts in Iraq. Many conservatives in the United States who voted for Trump have learned that lesson. They are in a state of shock, seeing that Trump appears not to have learned that lesson himself.
So far, Dr. Parsi, we've been talking about the theoretical possibility of what would happen if America entered the war. Suppose America doesn't. Suppose the MAGA movement actually carries conviction with Trump and he decides not to enter. Where does that leave Israel?
Well, Israel is going to have to face the consequences of its own mistake. It's not America's responsibility to fix those things, nor do I hope that it is something that India believes that is its responsibility. But if there isn't any war and there's a return to the negotiating table, again, depending on whether Trump has shifted his red line to the American red line rather than the Israeli red line, then we will likely be able to see a deal. It's still going to be very difficult, and it has become more difficult as a result of what the Israelis have done. Unfortunately, one of the immediate consequences of Israel's illegal attack is that the demand, the support for weaponization in Iranian society and within the Iranian elite has increased dramatically. Prior to this, the balance inside the Iranian government was in favor of not weaponizing the nuclear program. But this has shifted, which again was very predictable. And many non-proliferation experts, including heads of the IEA, have stated over and over again, you bomb Iran, you almost guarantee that there will be an Iranian bomb. But I think that there still is a pathway to prevent that through negotiations. But the longer we wait, the harder it will get.
Are you worried that if Israel is left alone to fend for itself, without the hope that the Americans will actually do what's called the dirty work for them, I'm quoting the German chancellor, that they might choose to take out Ayatollah Khamenei? Trump, in his famous tweet, said, we, coupling himself with Israel, won't kill the Ayatollah for now. How safe would he be if Israel finds it has no other option to try and win the war than to take him out?
First of all, Israel has plenty of options, and they had options not to start this unnecessary war. The narrative that Israel had no choice, that it was in a corner and it had to, is just completely false. Israel did not need to conduct a genocide against Palestinians for the last year and a half. Israel has choices. It is constantly making the wrong choices. In this specific scenario that you say, if they go and try to assassinate the Ayatollah, again, I think it will very much depend on whether this is something done by the Israelis or whether it's done by the Americans. If the United States is involved in it, I fear we will have total war. If the Israelis are doing it, then will be a continuation of an Israeli-Iranian war. Will it disrupt the Iranian system? It may very well do so. But I think we have also seen that in the first 12 to 18 hours of this war, the Israelis were tremendously successful in taking out a large number of top Iranian military officials. The Iranian air defenses were asleep. In fact, there was criminal neglect on the Iranian government side because they did not take the threat of an Israeli military attack seriously. And I think to a large extent that was because talks were supposed to take place on Sunday and the attack came on Friday. And they never envisioned that the Israelis would attack Iran 2 days before negotiations between the US and Iran. Nevertheless, despite those major blows, within 18 hours, the Iranians had restructured the command and control and then began attacking Israel back. And we have not seen the type of disintegration of the regime, despite the fact that this was the largest amount of deaths inside the Iranian regime at the very top that we have seen throughout its entire history. So the question then is, have they over the last couple of days prepared themselves for a scenario in which Ayatollah Khamenei is killed? I would suspect that they have. Will it be successful? Will they have control? We do not know. But I think what matters here is whether the US is involved in it or not. If it's only Israel, it will remain an Israeli-Iranian war. If the US is involved, it will lead to a regional war.
All of that, in a sense, hinges on the question, how deeply and how effectively has Mossad and Israel intelligence infiltrated the Iranian system? After all, it must have come as a shock to you to discover that Israel had established a drone base near Tehran, that Mossad commandos were operating deep inside Iran, and Reuters reports that many of Iran's radars and surface-to-air missile launchers were taken out this way. And this is not the first time Israel has infiltrated itself into the Iranian system. Last year, they were able to kill Ismail Haniyeh when he was a guest of the Iranian government in Tehran. So does it not worry you that Israel may have infiltrated itself deep into this system?
Whether it worries me or not is not a material to this conversation. What you're pointing to, though, is absolutely correct. The Israelis have had a tremendous amount of success in infiltrating the Iranian intelligence services and security services. They would not have been able to do this. The question, of course, that is in the minds of the Iranians is that how come what the Israelis are doing is so similar to what the Ukrainians are doing in Russia, particularly with the recent attack that they had in air bases. It's exactly the same methodology. The idea that these two things would come into existence independently of each other without any connection is obviously difficult to believe. And the connection between the two of them, of course, from the perspective of the Iranians, is the United States. Nevertheless, this is undoubtedly a tremendously successful tactical measures that the Israelis have taken. And they have done so before as well. I mean, one of the most stunning successes they had is that they actually smuggled in a robot that they controlled through bases in Israel, and they used that to identify the head of the Iranian atomic energy program earlier on and assassinated. So tactical successes of that kind, the Stuxnet virus, etc., the Israelis have scored so many of those. Strategically, it has not changed the direction of the situation. Again, if it had, Israelis would not have been attacking Iran right now. The question is, of course, if the latest ones may have done so, and it remains to be seen whether that is the case or not.
Against this background, it was announced this afternoon that Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi is meeting 3 of his key European counterparts in Geneva tomorrow. Could that meeting possibly produce a ceasefire, and one that would be acceptable to Israel, or do you think it's unlikely?
I think it doesn't stand a chance. The Europeans have zero leverage in this situation. The Europeans have essentially made themselves irrelevant. The Europeans are coming out giving Kafkaesque statements, not condemning clear violations of international law. The bombing of these nuclear facilities is a violation of Geneva Conventions, Article 56, the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions. When the Russians have done this in Ukraine, the Europeans have fallen over each other, condemning it, and rightfully so. Here, they're staying completely silent. In fact, what the German chancellor said that you quoted earlier on is a legitimization of an Israeli war of aggression. So the Europe that we knew from 25 years ago, that stood up against the Iraq war, that stood in the for international law, is no longer in existence. I frankly do not know what the point is of the Iranian foreign minister meeting with the Europeans. I think it would have been much smarter for the Iranians to actually do everything they can to start talks with the United States at this point in order to end this war, rather than talking to the Europeans.
Before I end this interview, let me ask you to look a little down the road for me. What is the impact the present conflict is having, and could have if it continues, on the image and standing of the Iranian regime?
It all depends, of course, on how this ends. It's a very divided world out there. Inside of the Middle East right now, amongst many of Iran's very strong Arab rivals who have very little love, if any at all, for this Iranian regime, they are now tremendously worried about that if the Israelis succeed and there is regime collapse, that there will be massive chaos and they will pay a heavy price for it. B, if the Iranians fight back and strike American bases, that means that the war comes, not just the chaos, but the war comes to Arab territory. And 3, if the Israelis are successful, what kind of a Middle East is going to continue to exist? Mindful of the fact that this was an illegal act taking place 2 days before negotiations, with no condemnations or opposition from the West. This is creating a lot of concern, even among those who actually signed agreements with Israel, that this is going to be a very brutal, aggressive Israeli hegemony in the region. And one country that in particular probably is worried is Turkey, because Turkey has a strong military, and anything that manages to potentially challenge Israel's hegemony in the region is going to be a target by the Israelis. And in fact, after the Turks were very successful in Syria and the fall of the Assad regime, we saw how dramatically the narrative in Israel changed about Turkey and increasingly talked about it as a threat that needed to be dealt with. So the question is, when is there an end to this? If Israel is going to continue to target and take out and destabilize every country that it thinks potentially down the road could be a challenge to it.
I hear what you're saying, Dr. Parsi, and all the outcomes that you listed are still a few weeks, months, even a year or so ahead in the future. But there's one that's already happened. Iran's allies and friends such as Hamas, Hezbollah, the former Assad regime in Syria, and the military capacity of the Houthis, not necessarily their political standing, have been pretty effectively decimated. Doesn't that leave Iran, however it emerges from this conflict, a diminished and somewhat discredited regional power?
It definitely has weakened Iran. There is no doubt about that. It has not that necessarily all of those elements were part of Iran's deterrent structure. Hezbollah certainly was. Assad certainly was. The Houthis not so much. Hamas not at all. But nevertheless, that has dramatically reduced Iran's capabilities, its deterrence capabilities, and depending on how this war ends, of course, we will see the rest of that picture. When it comes to the standing in terms of political support, I think the picture is a little bit more mixed, mindful of the fact that this is the only time in the last year and a half in which a nation state actually is fighting back against Israel in a relatively more effective way. And that has won a tremendous amount of support, at least on the Arab streets. That doesn't necessarily translate into any political power for now, but it may have something that could be used by the Iranians down the road. We do not know that at this point, but it all very much depends on how this thing ends at the end of the day.
Finally, no matter how this war ends, or rather I should rephrase myself, if the war ends with Israel having the upper hand, would that also mean that Israel has emerged from this conflict as the undisputed regional power of the Middle East?
I think in many ways it already has. And the way that it has managed to get to that position is not because of its own power. It's because of a complete lifting of all restrictions from the United States on Israeli conduct. Let me give you an example. In 2004, the Israelis assassinated the head of Hamas, the founder of Hamas, Sheikh Yassin. I think they killed about 9 or so of his relatives. That earned them a condemnation from the Bush administration because of the large number of collateral damage, essentially civilians that were killed in that attack, 9 or so. When they tried to kill Nasrallah in 2006, they targeted his bunker several times, but did not manage to break through because the United States would not give them the type of bombs that would destroy the entire neighborhood and kill scores of civilians. When they finally killed him last year with the help of the United States, they took down the entire neighborhood, used 70 or 80 bombs, 2,000-pound bombs, killing more than 300 or 400 people who were living in that neighborhood completely innocent. And they got a congratulatory note from the Biden administration. What you have here is a complete lifting of any restrictions on Israel, any regard for international law, any regard for the norms of the use of force. And that is what has enabled, and with, of course, with the active support of the United States in terms of weapons and technology, that is what has enabled the Israelis to achieve this position.
It sounds as if you're saying that for Israel to be successful, America has to turn a complete and total blind eye to how it's done.
That's the entire life story of Israel at this point, yes.
Dr. Parsi, thank you very much for the time you've given me, and thank you very much for your analysis. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.